Hello, fabulous listeners. Thanks for tuning in to Old Bodies Outside. This is your host, Dr. Brian Peterson. This episode's guest is Alex Marquardt, who is the Executive Director of the Climate Defense Project, which is a legal nonprofit that advises and supports the climate movement primarily in the United States. The Climate Defense Project has been a leading advocate of the climate necessity defense, also known as the choice of evils defense, in which nonviolent protesters have argued for the legal justification of minor lawbreaking to address the climate emergency. Over the last several years, the Climate Defense Project has helped secure the first written rulings allowing climate necessity defenses at jury trials and the first appellate opinions recognizing it. You can learn more about the Climate Defense Project at www.climatedefenseproject.org. Additionally, our guest Alex has written about the climate necessity defense, fossil fuel divestment, and climate justice in The Nation, Fast Company, The Hill, and the Boston Globe. He has given talks at Harvard Law School, Stanford Law School, the University of British Columbia, and the Climate Litigation Accelerator at NYU School of Law. Part of the purpose of the Old Bodies Outside podcast is to boost conservation ethic, which led me to inviting Alex on the show. So Alex, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so where are you connecting in from?
I'm in Berkeley, California at the moment.
Nice. And what states do you practice law in?
So I am barred in Washington State for reasons that are a little hard to explain. When I started this organization with a couple of friends, we wanted to spread out our bar licenses, and we were working all over the country, so we kind of chose states that we thought were going to be strategic.
Nice. Okay, well, why don't we jump in and hear a little bit more about the Climate Defense Project? And you kind of mentioned starting with your friends there. So how did the Climate Defense Project get started?
Yeah, so I went to law school starting in 2013. I ended up going to Harvard, where this was a time in my life when I could have gone in different directions. I think I chose law school for maybe not the most mature reasons, right? I was in my 20s and I kind of wanted to project this image of conventional success. I had been interested in going to grad school in ethnobotany and studying that sort of thing. But I ended up in law school, and I met a bunch of students who were in the fossil fuel divestment campaign. And that's where I met two very like-minded law school classmates, Kelsey Skaggs and Ted Hamilton. And those are the two folks that I ended up starting Climate Defense Project with.
Nice. And so what was going on at that time that was your primary motivation to form this team and kind of go to the courts?
Yeah, so at that time, the fossil fuel divestment campaign at Harvard was very active. This was in 2013, 14, 15. And it was sort of still kind of a new movement at the time. And that's really the kind of the crucible that we got swept into. And we ended up filing a lawsuit actually against Harvard over its fossil fuel investments, which was not ultimately successful, but was a good exercise for us as law students trying to kind of get the lay of the land. And it was also an active time in the climate movement. It was around the time that the climate necessity defense, which I think you mentioned in the intro, started attracting the notice of climate protesters and some folks started attempting to use it in court. And so it was a good time for us to be, coming up in law school and interacting with some of these folks. We didn't really want to do the typical things that people do when they graduate from law school. We didn't want to work at a big firm or for the government. And so we actually got some seed funding from our law school to start this nonprofit together.
Oh, fantastic, fantastic. And so, for those listeners that aren't familiar of the fossil fuel divestment, and what is meant by that?
Yeah, so the fossil fuel divestment movement, I think, started way back in, when was it? Might have been 2009, 2010, something like that, with Bill McKibben and some students at Middlebury College. And their original demand was just that the school not invest in, I think it was the top 200 fossil fuel companies, um, ranked by sort of size of their capitalization, or I'm not familiar with exactly how that's done, but it was just the idea that fossil fuel finance is this really important thing to think about. That was kind of a novel idea at the time. This idea that the money pipeline is what allows a lot of these projects to be built, and if you attack that, you can be effective in many ways.
Nice, nice. Well, that's fantastic. It's fantastic. And so, this necessity defense, how is that used in climate change litigation? Maybe before you answer that question, for those that aren't familiar out there, do you want to just explain the necessity defense?
Yeah, so we mostly do criminal defense at Climate Defense Project, and so our clients are people who do civil disobedience, almost always nonviolent by any definition, and who get arrested as part of that because they broke a law. Right? They either trespassed, or maybe they blocked an entrance to a building or something as part of their protest, and so they're being charged by the state with a criminal charge related to that. And so that's where we come in. And the necessity defense is actually a very, very old defense that did not arise in a protest context. It came over from England, when we kind of started this country. And it was mainly used in kind of these emergency situations, right? Like when the captain of a ship had to dump the ship's cargo in a storm in order to keep from the boat sinking, right? Situations like that, or when you have to break into a burning building to save a baby, kind of these prototypical examples, right? So it's obvious why you might need a defense like that in the law. But then in the 20th century, protest movements started using it. So the war against, the movement against the war in Vietnam was one where people were starting to argue that actually maybe sometimes civil disobedience is necessary to try to prevent some of these larger harms in the world that we live in, and given our current political system, right? And so that's kind of what it came out of. It's been used by a lot of movements since then, but climate protesters started using it about 10 years ago.
Okay. And so was it the use by climate protesters that inspired you and your colleagues to utilize that when you're... Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. We had heard about a person named Tim DeChristopher, who was one of the first early climate activists to try to use this defense. He had posed as a bidder at an oil and gas auction, and didn't really intend to pay. He got charged with some federal crimes for that, and in part because this was a very, very early use of the defense by a climate protester, and also because he was in federal court, it was just a really uphill battle for him. He did end up spending some time in prison for that. But it was this really galvanizing moment, and a lot of people kind of saw that happening and were excited by the possibilities.
Yeah. So do you think that actually gave it some steam and being more accepted when you're in court and as a legal justification?
So the road to legal recognition of the climate necessity defense by judges and courts has been, it's been tough. It's not the sort of thing that often results in like favorable opinions, in part because if you win in trial court, then you're not appealing, and the only decisions that kind of go into the formal legal record are decisions by higher courts, like appellate courts and the state Supreme Court. And so it's been tricky for that reason, and also just because, as you can imagine, a lot of judges are a little skeptical of the idea that people need to resort to extra legal methods, or things that involve breaking the law in order to address these political problems. I think there's a desire to believe that our system works well and that we can just vote in politicians who will do the right thing.
Yeah. Well, I think it's necessary, especially when it doesn't seem like from the political arena there's much help against climate change.
Yeah, that's certainly been the argument of our clients, and many of the expert witnesses too, who are willing to testify in these trials, feel very passionately about that.
Yeah, no, I believe it. Yeah. So, what other types of legal strategies besides the necessity defense might be, utilized here and there? I know the necessity defense one is the most effective, but what are some other strategies that might be used?
I would say that the climate movement as a whole is, it's changed a little bit since we first started the Climate Defense Project. I think there's a little less interest these days in the climate necessity defense, in part because of some of those challenges I was mentioning, but also a lot of younger people are just kind of disillusioned with the legal system. And so, a lot of what we're doing these days is sort of more traditional criminal defense. We just hired two fantastic new staff attorneys who are in Minnesota helping some of the folks who are still working through the system, who were charged in connection with Line 3 protests. There's that Enbridge pipeline, Line 3 in Minnesota, that's been really controversial, and other pipelines being built in kind of the Midwest. So we do a lot of that kind of criminal defense work now. We've also been working, kind of going back to our roots, since I met my two co-founders in law school. We've been working with a lot of students at colleges and universities who are trying to get their schools to divest from fossil fuels. This is an ongoing thing, and so we've been filing complaints with state officials that explain why we think that fossil fuel investments should be considered violations of charitable law, since they don't really further any kind of public interest or educational mission. And so that's been, it's a creative argument, but one that we think is actually a decent reading of the law.
Yeah, it definitely seems like it doesn't help boost education at all. And so,
yeah,
how many? I mean, there's a lot of universities out there. I have no clue to even guess how many universities there are across the United States, but it's quite a few. And there's California alone has a lot. I'm a native Californian. That seems like that's something that's probably just could be ongoing for a lot of years to come.
Yeah, it has been a big project. We were actually surprised by, just how ongoing this has been and how many schools have contacted us since those initial filings that we did. I think it's also the case that although a lot of schools have made divestment commitments or commitments to divest from fossil fuels specifically, there are a lot of other divestment campaigns too. Even though we've had a lot of success in the divestment movement, there's still a lot of holdouts, a lot of schools that are really resistant to this, and so this is a reflection of kind of where a lot of campaigns are at when the dialogue breaks down with kind of school officials, and you have to resort to these kinds of tactics.
Gotcha. And so, who typically reaches out to you from a university to talk about fossil fuel divestment?
Yeah, it's almost always students. These campaigns are largely comprised of undergraduate students, sometimes grad students as well, and sometimes alumni. But usually we're working with students who are just taking time out of their busy semesters to sort of do this stuff, for no pay and to sort of just do the right thing. So, yeah.
That's fantastic. It's great to hear that students are interested in that. I know that there's younger generations, there's disillusionment. I understand that, but I'm glad to hear that students are reaching out to you to make any change possible. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, so with the Climate Defense Project, do you offer any services or trainings that empower individuals and communities to take action on climate change?
We do. We usually let folks approach us if they have criminal defense needs or something else that they think we can help them with. But once we do start working with folks, we will offer trainings in things like civil disobedience and how to interact with the police if you're in a situation like that. we also give people basic information about the climate necessity defense. And sometimes we work with other groups, like other nonprofits who are in the climate space and who want basic advice about, you know, things having to do with organizational law. How do you start a nonprofit? How do you stay legally compliant? Not that we're the foremost experts on that subject, but I think in the activist scene where people are often working in a sort of funding environment where you don't have a ton of money and you just need someone who's like-minded and sympathetic to give you basic advice, we do a lot of that. So.
Nice. One of the things that has come up in so I'm a professor of park management and conservation, and we will have roundtable conversations with grad students that are just fantastic. You hear a lot of perspectives from a variety of people. And one thing that has come up a number of times in those conversations is people questioning if the phrase climate change is effective, or if it'd be more effective if it was like anthropogenic climate change. Have you ever been involved with those types of conversations?
Yeah, I have. I think it's really fascinating the way that this term has sort of shifted. I mean, in the very beginning, right, people were using terms like global warming.
Right.
And then, I don't know, I think I've heard that maybe it was in part the fossil fuel industry that pushed for climate change because it sounds a little more benign or neutral.
Oh.
And now at this point, people are pushing for terms like climate emergency or climate crisis. And I think that I certainly understand where that comes from.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I guess it's kind of maybe searching for the term to try to get some sort of political support. I mean, it just seems like there's, like the agreement in Paris, I don't think there's any fossil fuel companies that abide by some of the agreements there.
Yeah, certainly I think the terminology that we use needs to be reflective of the scale of the crisis and sort of who is most culpable. And I think the movement is doing a pretty good job of, kind of upping the ante and using good terms. I think the term water protector is now in the lexicon too, and that's another great one just to sort of talk about folks who are trying to protect largely kind of indigenous lands from the harms of fossil fuel pipelines.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So what was that one again? Water protector?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Water protector, land defender. These are some of the words that have been used in the context of the fights against pipelines in the U.S. and Canada.
Yeah. I hadn't heard of those words used that way. I do like climate emergency. That one, puts an urgency on it, which, could be helpful in trying to convince people in the political arena.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so one of the phrases that you mentioned earlier was civil disobedience. And so one of the questions I just wanted to ask was, why should people care about climate civil disobedience versus taking very extreme measures? Why is civil disobedience the most effective way kind of going forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, we think it's effective. I think there's room for kind of reasonable disagreement on some of these more strategy or tactics focused questions. But I think, people who have kind of theorized about nonviolence, and there are different folks who have done that. Gene Sharp is one person who comes to mind, in part because we have a board member who's kind of really fluent in kind of his writing. But I think the idea is that nonviolence is a strategy that is sort of like playing the game on your terms, right? Where if you're leading a grassroots social movement, you're probably not going to have access to armies and police and that sort of violent coercive power that governments have, right? And so it's not really to your advantage to try to make change on that level or combat that kind of coercive force, right? And so the idea behind nonviolence and kind of protest is that you're able to use a different strategy that can also be very effective. I mean, everybody's heard of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., and they were some early proponents of this strategy, which I think especially early on in the 20th century, was seen as completely new and unlikely to succeed. People thought that violence was the only way that you could do something like overthrow a dictatorship or, win any kind of political progress. And so it's been really, really amazing to see the history of the 20th century and how it's become more and more widely practiced and accepted. And I think that's really the consensus now among certainly grassroots social movements on the political left, to sort of embrace nonviolence. I think you're seeing a little more impatience with younger people, especially as the climate crisis becomes more and more dire. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that people are embracing violence. I think maybe property destruction to some extent, which falls into kind of a gray area as to whether that's nonviolent or not.
Yeah. Do you have any idea how far back the idea of civil disobedience goes? I mean, for me, I think it has to go way further back than Henry David Thoreau, but that's where it got introduced to my mind.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I have a feeling it goes further back than any of us really knows, right? Certainly the Boston Tea Party and throwing tea into the Boston Harbor, could be construed as an example of civil disobedience. And often when we have experts in civil disobedience talk to juries, or prepare to talk to juries, it doesn't always, happen because of what judges decide in these cases. But they want to use examples that people are familiar with and that help demonstrate that this actually can be seen as a very patriotic thing, right? To be trying to protect us from kind of climate emergency. So.
Yeah, well, in that patriotic aspect, I mean, it does feel like the United States got founded on some acts of civil disobedience,
right?
With writing the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, exactly. So it's all about how the history is written,
right? Yeah, and oftentimes a lot's left out, unfortunately.
That's right.
Okay, so the next question I wanted to ask was kind of focusing in on people that are less fortunate socioeconomically speaking. How is climate change a threat multiplier?
Yeah, so this is a term that I think just tries to underscore the fact that climate change interacts with all these other social issues and forms of kind of inequality that we have in our world. And often the people who are hit first and worst are folks who are already struggling. So that would be poor people, people of color, people from other marginalized groups. And so you see that, here in the US and around the world. And it's been something that has, I think the climate movement didn't always do a good job of talking about that, and still has some work to do. You're nodding, so it sounds like you're familiar with this history. It started out as a very white movement. And, Teddy Roosevelt and wanting to protect, spaces so that people could basically have areas for recreation and hunting and things like that. But I think it's, especially in recent years with the Black Lives Matter movement and the kind of effort to highlight the indigenous struggles against pipelines and other fossil fuel infrastructure, I think it's really become a more diverse and inclusive movement. It still has a ways to go, but it's getting better.
Yeah, well, that's good that some progress is made by that. But yeah, it seems like with climate change, it's the marginalized populations that get hit the hardest with the ramifications of that. For the most part, broadly speaking.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of evidence of that.
Yeah. Okay, well, kind of concluding our conversation here, I just wanted to hear about what types of projects are on the horizon for the Climate Defense Project.
So we'll continue to do our criminal defense work, which is probably the bulk of our work at this point. We, as I mentioned, have some new staff attorneys in Minnesota who are doing great work. We will also continue to file the divestment complaints that I mentioned. We have a number of schools that we're working with. We're going to take a hiatus over the summer while they're on break, but in the fall they want to come back and file these complaints. And then I would say we continue to kind of look for ways to be effective. It's always a challenge. I mean, we started Climate Defense Project right away out of law school without getting experience first, which was kind of an unconventional decision. And so we've had to sort of focus on things that are a little off the beaten path that lawyers in more established areas are not working on. And so it's been kind of interesting to just see where we go with this and try to find a way that we can make an impact. But hopefully we'll continue to expand our work and keep doing new and different things.
Yeah. Well, even though y'all had a unconventional start, I'm glad that y'all got started and just, went forward and learn as you go, right?
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, Alex, this has been a great conversation, and I want to say thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule to hop onto a podcast that you received a cold email from to be a guest on. So I really appreciate you taking the time out of here and just being interested to be on Old Bodies Outside. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for doing the work that you do. It's really important, and I was glad to be on this podcast. So.
Yeah. Well, I think you're doing more important stuff. So. Okay, I'm going to throw on the outro music, and we'll call it an episode.
Okay.